Good morning and good afternoon to some of you. My name is Kelsey Schmitz. I'm the school mental health lead for the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, which is located in our region, in Region 10. And you are logging on today for our first of many webinar series related to creating trauma-responsive schools. Today is webinar 1, Trauma-Informed Skills for Educators, and you may have seen that we have some other webinars in these series, and we'll show you where you can find that additional information so you can sign up for some additional webinars as well. Okay, if I could have you go to the next slide, please. So here's a list of those webinars that we have available in this series. Our next one will be December 4th. Again, we encourage you to register and join. We know these are filling up fast, so if you see some that you're interested in, even if they are in the future quite a bit, we just encourage you to go ahead and sign up for those. Next slide. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network, this is a SAMHSA-funded project that was funded in 2018. There are 10 regional centers across the United States, as well as a network coordinating office in Stanford, National American Indian and Alaska Native MHTTC, and a National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC. We're located at the Northwest MHTTC, which is the upper left part of the country there in brown. So Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho are the states that we serve. We know we have people that have joined this webinar from across the nation, so we welcome you here and also encourage you to visit your region TTC for additional supports and resources and other training opportunities as well. Next slide. So for our Northwest MHTTC, our school mental health supplement goals are to provide direct training and technical assistance on the implementation of mental health services in schools, to build infrastructure and create learning communities, and to support educational leaders to promote mental health for all. Next slide. We encourage you to reach out to us. You can contact myself or my colleague Megan Lucy via email. You can also check out our websites where you'll find some more information and resources. And we'd also encourage you to sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already. This is how we'll be sending out the links to these webinars, as well as other resources or upcoming trainings. So if you haven't already, we encourage you to sign up for the newsletter. All right, next slide. So we're very honored to have two guest speakers with us today, Vivian Villaverde and Pamela Vona. We have 90 minutes session scheduled for you today. And if you have questions, we'd encourage you to use the Q&A feature below. We'll monitor that throughout the chat. We'll have some opportunities to take a pause and ask some of those questions to Vivian and Pamela. If you didn't get your question answered, we'd encourage you to reach out to us or Vivian or Pamela. They'll give you their emails at the end, and we'd be happy to follow up with any questions that you have and didn't get answered. Before we end, oh, sorry, next slide. We're going to take a little bit of time before we end today. We would really appreciate if you would just take a few minutes and complete the evaluation. These are required by our funder, but most importantly, we use these to inform, refine, and enhance our future events or activities. So we have an entire evaluation team that takes a look at these and summarizes this data and provides us back for future opportunities. So please help us by filling out those evaluations, help us communicate to SAMHSA the importance and the need for these types of trainings. It's of course voluntary and anonymous, and again, we'll take a few minutes when we end today to give you an opportunity to fill out those evaluations. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela and Vivian. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello. Good morning. Hold on. It's nice to be here with all of you this afternoon. We're very excited to be sharing this webinar with you. It has been developed by the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center for Resilience, Hope, and Wellness in Schools. And we are a center dedicated to the development of trauma-informed practices. And what's really unique about our center is that we've really focused on developing interventions that are designed specifically for the school system. And we've been doing that for about 20 years. I'll let my colleague Vivian introduce herself. I'll give you a little bit of my background, and then we'll jump right into the information.
Hi, good morning. My name is Vivian Villaverde, and I am a clinical associate faculty at USC Suzanne Dvorak School of Social Work, and I'm also a member of the Treatment Services and Adaptation Center. And just to give you a little bit of a background, I have been a school social worker for about 10 years prior to coming to academia. And I've worked with teachers, administrators, and other support services staff in developing support and developing programming for students. And so my training has been always in school social work, and especially in program development and collaborative work with child welfare, probation, as well as Department of Mental Health locally in Southern California. And so I've been doing this training along with disaster response work internationally for about 10 years now. So that's me in a nutshell. So I'll hand it over to my colleague, Pamela Bona, so she can tell you more about what's going to transpire today.
Hi, so I am Pamela Bona, and I am the program manager for the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center. And as I said, our center is tasked to develop trauma-informed practices for schools. And what I want to stress about what's different about this training that we're doing today is really our center's work starting about 20 years ago was dedicated to developing mental health interventions for schools. So these would be interventions that could be delivered by a school-based social worker, a school-based psychologist, and these might be some of interventions that you've heard of, potentially the CBITS intervention, SET, or bounce back. But what we've learned over the course of the past 20 years is that those interventions, while absolutely effective at ameliorating signs and symptoms of trauma in students, they are most effective and most optimal when they are implemented in a school setting where everyone is trauma-informed and trauma-responsive. And so that's what this training is dedicated to do. And so specifically today, what we want to do is talk about the different types of traumatic experiences that students experience and how often these things are occurring in the lives of our students. And then we really want to focus on how does trauma impact students' emotional, social, and academic functioning. And in order to understand that, we're going to take a little bit of a dive into the most recent neuroscience findings to help us better understand how the emotional, social, and academic challenges arise for some of our students. And then finally, what we want to do is really enhance everyone on campus's capacity to respond to students in a way that builds resilience and is sensitive to trauma. And the most of that will happen in the second webinar, part 2 of this webinar, where we'll really do a deep dive into practical skills for educators.
Okay, so basically what we wanted to look at is what is a trauma responsive school, and what types, we want to make sure that we're aligning it as well with SAMHSA, which is a federal office, so that we are able to have a shared language. And so that's one of the things that we is endeavoring to do is, as we look at what is a trauma responsive school, that we are trying to align it to the federal government's sort of infrastructure or framework. And that is for many reasons. One, so that we can develop a shared language. And then 2, also because of that shared language, we're hoping that we will also be able to access resources and funds and grants that might not be just dedicated to the Department of Education, but also, so we're looking at the 4 R's, which is, the first one is realizing the prevalence and impact of trauma, and then 2, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, and then 3, respond by integrating trauma-informed principles to create a safe, nurturing school climate, and then the last one is to resist in order to not to re-traumatize. So we're going to focus on the first 2, realize and recognize, and in part 2, we'll focus on respond and resist.
And so let's all take a minute to review this vignette because I think, first of all, we really need to just get a sense of how are we currently interpreting student behavior? What do our conversations with colleagues look like when we have different encounters with students? So I'll just quickly read this vignette. Carmen is a student in your math class. It is Drug Prevention Month. Over the past 2 weeks, Carmen has failed to complete several homework assignments. You warned her that if she didn't shape up, her grade in the class would continue to drop. Carmen rolled her eyes. Later that day, when Carmen was answering a question in class, another student made a comment to a nearby student. Carmen heard the whispering. She cursed and threw her book on the floor. She stormed out, knocking over her desk.
So what I want you to think about, this is an activity that we do, but we don't want to take it away, but we want you to put yourself in the particular scenario and just kind of contemplate a little bit. Think a little bit about what would be the typical response. So in this particular instance, reading Carmen's scenario, we would normally group you together as teachers, administrators, support services, whether it's a counselor, psychologist, or social worker, paraprofessional, security officer, or school police, as well as parents. So what we would like you to do is just, kind of pause a little bit. In the role that you have, what would be the typical reaction to a particular situation like this? And again, keeping in mind in your role, as well as the other responsibilities that you might have as a teacher, administrator, support services, as you react to Carmen's behavior at that particular moment. I'll pause just for a little bit. Okay, so having said that, I want you to keep in mind some of the typical reactions that you might engage in yourself, or the typical reactions some your colleagues might have demonstrated and you've taken note of, and then just keep that in mind as we proceed with the rest of the training.
Okay, so we're going to jump into part 1 of SAMHSA's definition of a trauma-responsive school. So first and foremost, we need to realize the prevalence of trauma and then its impact. So first and foremost, one of the questions we often get asked is, what is the difference between childhood adversity, stress, trauma? And so we think this graphic starts to help to clarify that somewhat. And so this is really a spectrum of moderate stress to severe stress. And we can think about childhood adversities being on that continuum. And certainly these would be things that include things like homelessness. It could include child abuse, other sorts of neglect, and all of those things would fall on this spectrum. Now, what happens is when something is so profoundly threatening or is perceived as extremely scary, that's when we get what we call the trauma reaction. So trauma is really a very specific reaction to severe stress. And it's because of this experience of there being a sudden threat of injury or death, and the person is experiencing this situation as it being terrifying, horrifying, and in particular, they feel helpless. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a framework for this stress to trauma continuum. And it really leads us in very nicely into these definitions of trauma. And so on the left-hand side, we see that trauma arises from an inescapable stressful event that overwhelms an individual's coping mechanisms. So again, once it becomes so stressful that it overwhelms our ability to cope as we would with typical stress, then we are experiencing a trauma reaction. And then on the right-hand side, an individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful. I'm not going to read the rest of the definition because it's quite long, but what I want to focus on the orange, in the definition in orange, is that the experienced by are the two key words in that definition. And what that tells us is that trauma, in a sense, is subjective. So when we think back to this continuum here, for some kids, a particular adversity may fall in a more moderate stress. They may perceive it as more moderately stressful, where another student may experience it as severe and then have the trauma response. And so I think it is critically important that as educators, we really appreciate the subjectivity of trauma, because that helps us when we maybe have colleagues or people say to us, well, that doesn't seem that traumatizing. Why would he or she be so upset? And we have to appreciate that from their perspective, if it was experienced as that severely stressful, then to them it is traumatic, even though it may not be to someone else. And so we really talk about there being different types of exposure to traumatic stress. And first and foremost, there's acute exposure. And this is really something that's related to a one-time event. It's limited in duration. And so the example here that we see is a car accident. Other examples of acute exposure could be things like a natural disaster, a hurricane, an earthquake, a man-made large-scale disaster like a terrorist attack or a school shooting. So I encourage you to think about, whether or not you may have students that have been exposed to a one-time extremely frightening event versus students who may be experiencing chronic exposure. And so here we're seeing an example of a child who maybe is witnessing domestic violence in the home. But certainly there's other types of exposure to stress, chronic exposure. And these could be things like homelessness, poverty, neglect, physical abuse. So again, thinking about whether or not maybe you have students who fall into this bucket. And I will say that in the trainings that we do across the country, we really are dealing with a lot of students who have a very significant load of chronic exposure to some of these childhood adversities. And then thirdly, there's complex trauma. And what complex trauma is it's really insidious, because in this particular situation, oftentimes the person who's subjecting the child to trauma is someone that should be trusted. It's a caregiver or a caregiver system. And so in these circumstances, what we often see is these children having a very hard time trusting adults. And I'm sure some of you right now may even be thinking of students who have a really hard time forming relationships with adults. And that's because their prior experiences with individuals who were supposed to care for them did not do so. And this is often of a very invasive interpersonal nature. So when we think about complex exposure, we think about things such as sexual abuse being an example of complex trauma.
Mm-hmm. And then we have the historical trauma or intergenerational exposure. Historical or intergenerational exposure. So just to kind of let you know, to read a little bit off of it, trauma related to cumulative physical, psychological, and social wounding over the lifespan and across generations, resulting from massive traumatic events experienced as a group. So this type of trauma can be passed on a big scale, like a Holocaust or slavery, and it can also be experienced within smaller communities or family. So one of the best example I can bring up is one faculty that I had in the past. She brought a case sample or scenario where a particular student was having night terrors and just really having such a hard time functioning in school and functioning at home, and they could not figure it out. So they were looking for his night terrors is coming from this particular war scenario that they just have no idea where it's coming from. So they've exhausted like videos he's watched as well as any other sort of experiences or travel that they've had. But this particular student is a Native American student, and what happened was that they decided to really consult with the elders of the tribe just to try to figure it out. And what come to find out, what he was describing was an actual tribal experience or historical event that happened in the past that has been talked about by generations and are discussed in family gatherings. And so what they didn't account for is that this student was listening and hearing all of these things, and it has manifested and it's been handed down to him. So these are the kinds of, this I think really demonstrates what this is all about in terms of that subconscious narrative, historical narratives that our students might have been exposed to, but just have no context in terms of figuring out how to handle it. And so that's one of the things that we could think about to illustrate historical exposure. But also we could look at communities where they have long and multi-generational history of poverty or any other kinds of family or big-scale community experiences, shared experiences. So keep that in mind as we move into it. Before we go into this, we just kind of wanted to pause. Any questions so far?
I haven't seen any questions yet. Okay,
perfect. So thank you for that. So we want to move on into the groups with vulnerable to higher rates of childhood adversity and trauma exposure. So we have 5 different at-risk or vulnerable groups that we want to address. If we could just go back real quick. So children from under-resourced community, children whose parents have an alcohol or drug dependency, LGBTQ+ youth, immigrant refugee students, as well as special education students. So I wanted to start with students from under-resourced community. As I've said before, in the intergenerational trauma, poverty is something that could be passed on from generation to generation, and it could be cyclical. So what things to note, this is possibly true, not just in the rural area, but as well as in the urban area. They're more likely to be involved in gangs and be exposed or be involved themselves in community violence incidents. They could experience housing insecurity and also a greater likelihood of being in contact with other systems as an example, child welfare and the juvenile justice system as well. So I just wanted to share this statistic. A startling number of students are exposed to violence and trauma. So this is from Finkelhorn, and if you look at this, 6% of students who are in this type of communities are exposed to being sexually victimized, 6%. And then if you go all the way to the other end, being exposed to violence, it's 58%. So that's more than half of the students in this community. And then this is more of a local study. And if you look at it, this is within LA Unified School District. And this was 6th graders. And from no violence, 6%, but having gun, knife violence, or involving violence not involving a weapon, we're at 50, 40, and 54. And then any type of violence, that's 94. That's 9.5 out of 10. So that's pretty high.
Yeah, and just to emphasize, again, this was a sample of 6th graders. So these are early middle school students. And what's really profound is, I think, just really stressing on that 40%. That, you know, that's nearly half of the classroom being exposed to violence with a deadly weapon. And so I encourage you to think about the makeup of your community and whether or not, this maps on.
Mm-hmm. And then moving on, we have children whose parents have substance use dependency. Children with one or more parents with a substance dependency are twice likely to experience physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and just think about other secondary stressors as well as adverse events that could come with that substance use of having a caregiver who is substance dependent. The next, we have the LGBTQ youth. They tend to experience higher rates of physical abuse, verbal victimization, and that comes with bullying, whether it's cyberbullying or in-person bullying, and then also experiencing rejection and isolation from family and friends. And so not having that sense of belonging. And so that is something that we have to really look at in terms of vulnerability. And then we have our immigrant and refugee students. 79% of immigrants had experienced a traumatic event before migration, such as witnessing killing, being assaulted, suffering. So I think one of the things that we have to look at is that before the newly immigrant cohort comes to whatever destination they have, they might have been exposed to multiple incidents and multiple events. And just a suggestion, if you haven't had a chance to see anything like this, there's a YouTube video called La Bestia. So it's a short documentary, so please do look at it when you get a chance. It's called, just search La Bestia, B-E-S-T-I-A. And so that documents or chronicles a journey of an immigrant trying to get to America, and just to see what that's like for them. Some of these students, based on their legal status, may experience additional stress related to deportation and separation. And so I think another thing that we have to look at, we have current students here who are residing in the United States that are constantly in fear that when they come home, a parent might not be there, a family or a relative might not be there because of the different immigration sweeps that are happening. So this is adding a lot of stress and really instability for the kids that we work with. 25% of immigrant children reporting being treated unfairly by peers and 14% by adults because of who they are. And again, with the current climate that we have, what are the types of communication and the safety concerns our students might be experiencing because of the rhetoric that's happening right now? Okay, and then lastly, in terms of vulnerable population, we're looking at special education. So more likely than others, non-special education peers, our special education students might be experiencing verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And again, we have to look at it from all points of view, what kind of isolation experiencing they're having within the school, outside in the community, as well as within their own family. So how prepared are the families in responding to the needs of their children as well? So again, we're looking at all of them. They tend to be of a higher vulnerability when exposed to any one of the trauma exposures that we discussed earlier.
Okay, and so then I just want to kind of close out this section by revisiting the adverse childhood experiences study. And so I'm certain that a very high percentage of you on the webinar today have likely heard about the ACEs study. And just to give you a little bit of background on how it came about is Vincent Folletti, he was an obesity doctor in San Diego, California. And he was working with his patients and trying to help them lose weight and become more healthy. And they were having some struggles in doing so. And what he ended up doing was taking some time to really sit with them and learn about them and what was associated with some of their struggles. And inevitably, nearly every patient that he spoke to, they reported having some type of adverse childhood experience in their childhood or their adolescence. And so he began to develop this hypothesis, and he started to wonder, is there a relationship between experiences, negative experiences that we have in childhood and adolescence, and does it actually link to our adult health. And so he ended up partnering with the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, and they conducted the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And what they did was they selected kind of a subset of the childhood experiences that we think about, that spectrum of childhood adversity. So they included things like emotional and physical neglect, physical abuse, parental drug abuse. You know, these aren't all of the adversities our students face, but this is a pretty good sampling. And so they wanted to do two things. They wanted to find out how often these things are actually happening in the lives of people. So they conducted the study. And on the left-hand side, we have pulled out what we think are some of the most interesting findings as it relates to prevalence. And so these individuals, and again, the sample was from San Diego, California. So we have a very white, a very middle-class sample. Nonetheless, one in four individuals reported growing up with a parent that has abused drugs. We can certainly assume that that rate is higher now, given the opioid addiction. 1 in 5 people reported growing up who had a parent who had a mental illness. 1 in 4 had experienced physical abuse. And about 18%, 1 in 6, had experienced 4 or more ACEs. And that's pretty high, but we also know that this study didn't take into account some of the adversities that are related to homelessness, poverty. And so what we want to do is quickly show you this next video so that we can hear it from Dr. Roy Wade, who conducted the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study again, but only this time he ended up including things like poverty and homelessness. You will have this link in your PowerPoint, and we encourage you to watch the video. But in summary, he ended up finding that the prevalence of ACEs were significantly higher in the urban setting that he was working in. And so just take, a few seconds to really think about what you think are some of the more common adverse childhood experiences that your students are encountering. And perhaps there's a student that's coming to mind as you hear about some of this. So it's really important, I think, to really take this information, but apply it and think about it and apply it to the students that you're working with.
Just as in addition, I think too that we want to recognize that each community is really unique. So I think we're covering 4 different states with this MHTTC center, and so the invitation went to different communities in different states. So just think about it, the uniqueness and what might be those experiences that is unique to those pockets of community and subcultures that you might have.
Okay, so after we realize the prevalence of trauma, let's talk about its impact. I think that's really what we're here to talk about. And so for those of you who haven't read this, I certainly encourage you to do so, but I know everyone is busy, so I can just summarize it here for you in this quote. And Paul Toe is a fantastic writer who's essentially synthesized some of the most recent neuroscience findings and applied it to the field of education. And so what he says is, over the past decade, neuroscientists have determined how severe and chronic stress in childhood leads to physiological and neurological adaptations in children that affect the way their minds and bodies develop, and most importantly, the way they function in school. And so let's quickly talk about this neurological adaptation. So in order to understand how trauma impacts the brain, we have to understand the regions of the brain that are involved in the stress response. And this brain image isn't completely made to scale, but it does really highlight these 3 regions that are particularly important. So first and foremost, we have the amygdala, and that is the region of the brain that is, you can think of it as our brain's alarm system. Its job is to really look and sense and identify threats. And when those threats are identified, it turns on our fight or flight system. Essentially what happens is the amygdala will release a variety of chemicals, including adrenaline and cortisol. And this does things such as getting our heart racing and pumping blood to our muscles should we need to flee. It also shuts down systems that we may not need in that moment in order to respond physically to the threat. Our hippocampus is also involved because what it's going to do is it's going to store a memory of the event that's occurring, and it's also involved in the process of regulating our emotions during and after the stressful experience. And then finally, our prefrontal cortex. This is where all of our higher order thinking occurs. This is where we organize, we plan, we think critically. And so what's most important to recognize is that when all of these regions of the brain work together, we have an incredibly adaptive response to stress. We have a region of the brain that will get our body activated to respond to the stressful situation. We have a region of the brain that will help us think through the stress and figure out what to do next. And then our hippocampus is going to record a memory of it and also help to calm us after the stressful experience has occurred. And so this is really what we would see happening when we're experiencing sort of that everyday stress up into moderate stress. But unfortunately, sometimes our brain works a little bit differently. And when something is so severely stressful or experienced as life-threatening, something very different happens. And instead, our reaction to trauma looks a little bit more like this. So what you can see here is that the amygdala is still completely turned on, right? It's still lit up in green, meaning the amygdala is doing the work of getting our adrenaline pumping, getting the cortisol running through our body so that we can physically respond to the threat. But what you notice is that the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, they're not lit up as much, meaning that what happens is when our amygdala fires so powerfully, it actually shuts down other regions of the brain in order for the amygdala to allow us to respond instinctually. So in truth, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a very necessary thing. Sometimes we do in fact encounter situations that are so threatening that we need to respond instinctually. We don't have time to engage our prefrontal cortex and weigh the pros and cons of a response. And so this is actually a very healthy and adaptive response to an acute traumatic experience. So what might that look like? Well, let's quickly go through an example. Let's imagine you're taking a walk and suddenly a snake crosses your path. Before you even realize what you've seen, your body has responded. Your heart is racing, your energy has skyrocketed, and you're ready to flee, right? So what happened? Well, this is the process, right? Something scary, something threatening was perceived by your amygdala, which then produced the alarm system that overrode the thinking brain. It overrode the hippocampus and that prefrontal cortex. And so essentially, that led us into what we consider to be the true fight, flight, or freeze response. And so what's, again, important to stress here is that this is a very helpful neurological response to actual danger. This is a very good thing. Now, let's look at this example. Let's imagine a few weeks later, you're walking past your neighbor's house and you see a winding object in their lawn. Before you know it, your heart is racing and you're ready to flee. Only this time you realize that what you thought was a snake was only the neighbor's garden hose. All right, so then what happened here? Well, if you recall that part of what the hippocampus does and the amygdala is they record memories of these stressful experiences so that you can respond even more effectively the next time. So in this instance, the object that you perceived as a windy object, your body assumed was a snake again. And as you can see, it set off that exact same pathway as the actual snake did. And so what we want to stress here is that these false alarms are actually not as helpful to us, right? And they can actually be quite distressing because there wasn't an actual threat, yet our body responded physically as if there was. And so how does this apply to school? Well, here's an example of maybe how this might manifest in a classroom. So 2 weeks ago, Johnny was in a car accident. And one day while Johnny was sitting in class, a car skids down the road. The tires make a loud screeching sound. And then later in class, you look over and notice that Johnny is distracted and fidgeting in his seat. He looks agitated and uncomfortable. And so what we know happened here is that the sound of we can assume potentially that maybe the sound of the screeching tires was that trauma reminder. It was that part of the traumatic experience that got encoded into his brain. And then completely automatically, when that sound occurred again, his body took over as if the same exact threatening experience was happening all over again. And what's particularly distressing about these sorts of trauma reactions is that a lot of our students may not be able to tell you why they're suddenly agitated and uncomfortable. They may not have put the pieces together that the sound of the tire consciously or unconsciously reminded them of the car accident that they were in. And again, you may not know that they've been in a car accident. And so you may not have a context for this, for what you're seeing. And so that's why we really have to enhance our curiosity to wonder, is he suddenly distracted and fidgeting because he's just bored? Or I wonder if something else is going on, and how can I support him? Now, we talked about that acute stressful event and how it sort of shuts down the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. But what is happening for our students who are consistently being exposed to danger and other stressful situations? Well, what we've really begun to learn is, while it's not a perfect analogy, it's a good one, that our brains are a lot like a muscle. And the more we utilize a region of the brain, the stronger it gets. And conversely, the less we utilize regions of the brain, then they're not going to work as optimally. And so for our kids who are living in very dangerous, maybe they're living in a community with a lot of community violence, maybe they're living in a home with domestic violence. If that's the case, then their amygdala, that part of the brain responsible for keeping them safe, it is going to be doing a lot of work. It's going to be firing and firing and firing, and it's going to get really good at its job. But the unfortunate part is that when all of that cortisol gets sent through the body, it unfortunately impedes the growth of the hippocampus. And that's a really important region of the brain that we need to have functioning optimally from our students. Because again, look at what the hippocampus does. It helps us store memories, and it helps us regulate our emotions. And then similarly, if the amygdala is firing so powerfully that it's impacting the prefrontal cortex from functioning optimally, then our students aren't able to engage in all of those cognitive tasks that we need them to do in order to be successful in school. So planning, organization, problem solving, those things are going to be inhibited because their survival brain, that amygdala, is working so hard that it's sort of, we can say, pushing the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus offline.
And I also wanted to add, Dr. Bruce Ferry talked about this, and he does a lot of studies on child development and neurological development in relation to school-age students. And so what he talked about is that the neural pathways for communication between the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal, it's actually weakened. So that sometimes it's rerouted as well and interrupted because of that weakening. And so when students or young kids are exposed to chronic stress, those strong communication to create that balanced response, it's really interrupted and weakened so that it's not working together and it's not communicating as they should be in regards to finding the most appropriate or developmentally appropriate reaction to external stimuli.
Exactly. Yeah. Our brain is most healthy when all of these regions of the brain are integrated and connected and able to communicate with one another. And so let's just quickly talk about how, in the prior example, we talked about how acute trauma, a one-time experience, may show up in the classroom. How does chronic trauma show up in our schools? So here's a vignette which says, Susie was placed in foster care after witnessing domestic violence in her home. You notice that Susie seems on edge in the classroom. She is constantly nervous and fidgeting. These behaviors become worse when she hears loud noises such as the door slamming or people shouting in the school hallway. You have also noticed that Susie has had a hard time concentrating. While other students might be a bit nervous about exams, Susie becomes extremely stressed with her heart racing and her breathing speeding up. So I think it's important to think about, well, what's different about this example than the prior example of Johnny? And what we see here with chronic trauma is that you may have noticed there wasn't a trauma reminder. She's constantly on edge, nervous and fidgeting. And so for our students who are constantly being exposed to trauma, what happens is that becomes their new normal, the new way they're showing up in the world. Their brain has adapted to their environment, to their stressful and potentially dangerous environment. So it just becomes their new normal way of being, how they show up in the world. And again, what I'll stress is that this is also a really great video that summarizes the impact of trauma on neural development. And so certainly I encourage you to watch it, maybe share it with your colleagues, as it really does a good job of quickly summarizing some of that neuroscience that we just stepped through. And so finally, we'll just quickly look at this scan, and maybe some of you have seen it before, but these are two different PET scans. On the left, you have a child who, let's say, is typically developing. And if you look in the key at the bottom right-hand side, you'll see that red means there's a lot of activity in a particular region of the brain, and then you move all the way down to black, which means there's not a lot of activity. So what you might notice is at the front of the brain, in the brain on the right-hand side at the top, that would be where our prefrontal cortex is. And as you can see, there's significantly less red. We see more purple in that region of the brain. And then if you look at where those two circles are, that's our temporal lobe, and that's where the hippocampus is. And again, the hippocampus is the region of the brain, I can't stress this enough, involved in forming memories and regulating emotions. And look what's happened there. Look, as we talked about, that cortisol that runs through the body and impedes the development of the hippocampus. You can very much see how it has changed the way that this brain has developed. And so what we want to do is be thoughtful about how are our kids showing up in the world? How have their life experience formed who they are and how they're showing up in the classroom today? But I also want to mention that not all of this is doom or gloom, and that there are absolutely things that we can do to alter and help to restructure and re-architect our students' brains, and that's really what part 2 is going to be about, how we engage with our students in an optimal way to enhance their neural development and reverse some of these adaptations that we see in students.
And again, I'm going to quote some of what Dr. Bruce Berry has said regarding brain development. The younger we acknowledge that there is some sort of, stress reaction and trauma experiences, the more opportunity we will have in creating an environment and a space for children to really redevelop and reconnect those communication pathways in the brain so that they would start engaging the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus again. And so again, I think this is very much in alignment with what schools are trying to do right now in moving into the space of early intervention and universal services, which is that tier 1, is catching the kids that are struggling in the school at such an early stage so that we can really create an alternative environment where they can reconnect those different brain functions again.
Yeah, so I know that was a lot, so we certainly want to stop here and see if you guys have any questions on that neuroscience piece. If it's making you think about maybe some of your students' behaviors differently, certainly share that. Otherwise, again, we'll always be available via email or whatnot if you have questions that occur to you as you maybe review this slide deck in the coming days and weeks.
And Kelsey, any questions?
I'm not seeing any specific to the content. There is a question about links to the videos. So we will want to make sure we get those posted.
Yes. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I thought we had put those in there. We will absolutely send those around if they...
They're also in the handout PowerPoint that we sent to you. So when you send that handout PowerPoint, they can just click on the links.
Okay, great. Maybe, Megan, we can re-put the PowerPoint link in the chat box for people that may have come on late.
Okay, absolutely.
Oh, we do have another question that came in. Is it the hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex that helps us to calm after a stressful event?
Okay, so that's a really great question because it's really all of those regions working together. And so what would often happen is the perception that you have of the event that's coming from the prefrontal cortex, your sort of assessment of it, will then be able to communicate back to your limbic system where the hippocampus is. Okay, things seem manageable now. You can go ahead and start to calm the amygdala. If that's the, I think it's a reductive way of looking at it, but it really is part of those two regions of the brain communicating back together. And so what's difficult is that when the prefrontal cortex is offline or not working optimally, then it really can't communicate back to the hippocampus and the limbic system that things are okay or managing the stress.
Yeah. So I think I want to use the car accident example to kind of emphasize the importance of all three systems functioning. So for example, you get into a car accident,
like a
right?
fender bender.
Yeah, a fender bender. So there's that momentary time where you're shocked and you either have an outburst and you just cannot stop yourself and you react to things and you start yelling or however it is. Or you could also have this momentary shock too, where you're just speechless and you're frozen. So what happens is that you have that moment, but then the rest of your reactionary brain starts functioning and re-engaging back. So your brain, the prefrontal, starts analyzing what's in front of you and whatnot, and then your emotions, and you're probably digging up those memories of when you have a crisis or anything like that. How have you reacted in the past? And all three, the amygdala, the hippocampus, is sort of like constantly communicating and balancing, and finally like okay, I need to find out what is going on, what's around me, and then your emotions start calming down a little bit so that you're able to actually do things like talk to the person that's involved in the accident, or for you to actually stop and survey the scenario. Are you safe? Are they safe? And then other things start. So your emotions are regulated enough so that you can start engaging in this other responses that you start responding to. But imagine one of those, either the prefrontal or the hippocampus, severely incapacitated to respond, then what would be the sort of the most prominent reaction? Is it going to be just going with the amygdala, and it's either you're going to fight or you're just going to completely flee and freeze and not be able to function? And so imagine that being a well-balanced response system, and if one area is not functioning as well, what would that be like? What would be the resulting sort of action based on that particular accident? So hopefully that demonstrated a little bit how all three create a really well-balanced as well as a very high-functioning response system.
Thank you. Do we have time for just another question?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
For students experiencing mental health conditions, how do you tease out the difference between those conditions and trauma?
So that's a great segue into our next part, which is recognize signs and symptoms of trauma. But, I am very much a proponent of some of the movements happen. I know they're happening here in California. I don't know necessarily what's happening in the Northwest yet, but in some cases, they're considering having a screen out and ruling out trauma before we do any diagnosis of something like ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder. And so it's really important to, I think, put some of the behavior in context, get a fuller understanding of what's going on in a student's life before we can, really say with any sort of certainty that it is something like ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder, or even a learning disability, for example. And so that would be something that I would encourage. And certainly we also don't want, if we have educators and teachers on the webinar today, we don't want to make you step out of what your scope of work is. We understand that you are often not trained to be a school psychologist or a mental health therapist. And so what we really wanted to do is provide you with a basic roadmap of what trauma looks like, how trauma impacts the brain, which we just talked about, and then how this might manifest in the classroom. And then we hope that you'll be able to, with this shared language, approach your colleagues who are tasked to give a diagnosis, who are tasked to provide mental health services, and be able to collaborate in a way where everyone has a shared understanding about trauma.
And I think one of the things too, and we're hoping that we're addressing it, but I think in the next segment, you will look at it too. But for those who are mental health practitioners that are in the call, I think that would be a combination of a real full person and environment assessment, understanding what events might have transpired in that student's life, along with the understanding, assessing the full symptom spectrum that student is demonstrating or experiencing. And again, with the help of whatever screening tool that you might have. So I think it's really hard for us to give you a definitive answer because I think it would take all of those aspects of a complete full assessment to recognize whether there is trauma exposure or whatnot. But I think what I wanted to stress the most is that this movement of becoming trauma responsive as a system, how are we collaborating together, educators, mental health practitioners, in really recognizing whatever it is that we have to assess in order to make sure the students are supported in the most appropriate way. So hopefully that's helpful, okay? Are we okay moving? So I think looking at the time, I do want to move on to the next segment, which is the second R, So in the first R, we talked about realizing the prevalence and the impacts of trauma. So now we're going to move into recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. So what I want to point out with this one is that most of the time, what we see in the classroom, in the cafeteria, on the ground, are just what's observable behaviors that students are demonstrating. But what we wanted to point out is that there's usually so much more underneath that iceberg, and we're just looking and seeing the tip. Okay? So I wanted to start with talking about the 4 types of trauma symptoms. And we're going to categorize them as cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and physical. So when we're looking at the cognitive, common cognitive symptoms, we are looking at concentration and organizational. 2 of the things we're looking at, the concentration skills and as well as organizational skills. So with concentration, students have difficulty paying attention in the classroom. They are most likely not completing classroom and homework assignments. And in terms of organization, they have difficulty with time management, and they also have difficulty following instructions. So looking at that brain function and reaction as well, what is compromised when students are exposed to chronic stress is the prefrontal cortex. As you can see, it's all shaded gray and some of the light orange. And so there's not a lot of robust activity there. So again, the prefrontal cortex is responsible in organization, memorizing information, as well as analyzing information. And so if that is compromised, these are some of the results in terms of common cognitive impacts. And then another thing that we want to look at is memory. So again, having the prefrontal cortex a little bit weakened, and then looking at the hippocampus as well, in terms of the one responsible in storing memories of memories as well as regulating emotions. So they have difficulty recalling previously learned information. They have difficulty memorizing facts and lists, as well as finding the right words. And so it's that language and the articulation that's compromised. And then another one is looking at cognitive distortion. And so extreme or exaggerated thoughts, so they tend to have a belief that they can't handle situations, no one cares, I'm a bad person, I am powerless, and life is meaningless. So as you can see, the schema or the lens that all the experiences go through, that passes through, are on the negative, exaggerated negative side, rather than on the positive side that I am able to handle and deal with things. So I want you to pause just for like a second and think of some of the students you have in the classroom who are having difficulties, and how many of this are demonstrating this common cognitive symptomatology. So overall, looking at the impact on cognitive functioning, they have difficulty sitting still. They are having difficulties processing information, oral information. They have difficulty talking about their experiences or the way they're sort of reacting to external stimuli. They can't, they have difficulties remembering, contextualizing, organizing, setting goals, as well as concentrating. So think of Johnny, think of Susie, think of whoever students that you might have who's been exposed to chronic stress or have had severe trauma exposure or prolonged trauma exposure. Are we setting them up to fail when we're asking them to perform all of this task in the classroom? And at that moment in time, their brain is really not capable. And I'm stressing that moment in time, because at that moment in time, they have their brains are on a chronic stress response. So are we setting them up for success, or are we setting them up for failure? And again, that is most likely unintentional. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the common emotional symptoms, and I'm going to start with anxiety and depression. And so in terms of chronic stress responses, what we're saying is that the amygdala is the one that's more prominent and has the most functioning compared to the hippocampus and the prefrontal. And so in terms of regulating emotions and looking at being able to process what's in front of them, if the prefrontal and the hippocampus are not functioning well, and it's only the fight or flight or the survival brain is functioning, then we can see what emotional symptoms might be there or might be present. Common emotional symptoms. So we'll start with anxiety. So with anxiety, there's excessive worry about a variety of things, including school and health or safety of the family. There's doubt, there's restlessness, a sense of dread or fear of the future. And sometimes they're manifested in stomach aches and headaches as well, especially for the younger ones. So if what we're saying is that they would have difficulties regulating emotions, and remember the thought distortion that we're talking about. So what our students might be experiencing is that there's a lot of hopelessness and not, inability to really alleviate whatever is going on. And so all the anxiety is happening.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that point. So as we presented those extreme thoughts, those cognitive distortions of, I'll just quickly go back to them. I can't handle this situation because there's been lots of things happening. Well, it makes sense that a student then might develop some symptoms of anxiety, right? And I'm powerless, feeling like you can't manage a particular situation. Well, of course, it makes sense that that student might then be experiencing anxiety. So those cognitive distortions have a very direct impact on the subsequent emotional experience of students.
So then depression, feelings of hopelessness, and again, that relates back to that cognitive distortion, loss of interest in pleasure activities, fatigue, agitation, irritability, feelings of worthlessness and guilt, and difficulty with motivation. So one of the things that I want to point out is most of the time, the more anxious or the ones that exhibit more of an extroverted type of reaction to things are recognized, but because they're the ones who are getting in trouble. But the ones who might be disconnecting and more isolative, I just don't want us to miss those students and let them fall through the cracks. And so that's one of the things that we want to point out. And then we want to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder or any features and symptoms that might there be. So they might not have the full-blown, the more of the anxiety or the depression, but they're experiencing intrusive and distressing thoughts, again, connecting back to the distortion, avoiding of people and places and things that remind them of the trauma experiences, or they might also be jumpy and agitated or reenacting some of the experiences without conscious knowledge of it. So we want to make sure that we are also recognizing those symptoms and potentially identifying students that might be demonstrating them. And then looking at the common behavioral symptoms, again, prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, heightened emotion, not being able to regulate it, but then at the same time with a thought distortion that people are out to get me, it's hopeless, whatever I do, I'm still going to get in trouble. So that's the prefrontal cortex being compromised. So there might be acting out behavior, overreacting to seemingly typical circumstances, being jumpy, when alarms go off in their sounds, aggression, as well as shutting down, not engaging with families and friends as they previously done, and withdrawing from their typical routine, including activities such as sports and clubs. And then we go into the last cluster, which is common physical symptoms. We're talking fatigue, frequent tiredness, headaches or stomach aches, especially in younger children. These are more of the psychosomatic manifestation of it. Development or worsening of medical conditions. And this is something that we could look at, and again, in collaboration with potentially nurses at our school, looking at asthma, looking at, frequent stomach aches, as well as headaches and other worsening of chronic conditions.
All right, so then what happens when we put all of these different symptoms together, the cognitive symptoms where students are having difficulty concentrating, difficulty memorizing facts and figures. They're experiencing a variety of emotional responses to trauma, such as anxiety or depression. And then behaviorally, they may be acting out, right? So if we put those all together, it's not surprising that these are found to be some of the research studies around the academic performance of students. So decreased IQ and reading ability, more suspensions and expulsions, very likely related to that behavioral acting out, decreased rates of high school graduation, lower grade point average, and more days absent from school. And so for us, when we really think about, setting our students up to succeed, but also setting our schools up to succeed, because it's important for our students to be sitting in the classroom, right? We don't want them absent from school. We don't want to be suspending them or expelling them. And so what are we doing as a school system in order to change some of these trajectories here? So as a school system, are we really setting our school up to not, serve these kids because we're not addressing their trauma? And as a result, having some of these less than optimal academic outcomes.
Yeah. And just one thing about that, if you are looking for talking points for how to find allies in that trauma responsive school transformation, these are our talking points, because these are our deliverables as well as funding source for our system, for our schools. And if we're not able to meet all of these deliverables, then it impacts our overall ability to serve our youth in the community.
Yeah. And so I'm just going to show you two quick research studies. Maybe you've seen them. And so what this graph here is showing us is on the bottom, it's the number of adverse experiences a student may have encountered. So anywhere from 0 to 3 or more. And then on the left-hand axis there, it's the likelihood of having an academic problem. And so we see a very clear correlation that as the number of adverse experiences increase, so does the likelihood of academic challenges. And again, this is a different study, but really the same outcomes. If you're looking particularly at those black bars in each of the rows, that you see, again, on the bottom, number of ACEs as it moves up to the right, and then again, the likelihood of having a learning or behavioral problem in school. It drastically increases, as does the number of adverse experiences. And then we really want to stress that this is a trajectory. It doesn't just, these ramifications of trauma don't just stop, once kids graduate from high school, they extend into their adulthood. And so again, we see physical injury being more likely for people with significant childhood adversity, as we talked about, depression, anxiety, suicide. We have maternal health issues. Infectious diseases are more likely for individuals with adverse childhood experiences. Risky behaviors, chronic disease, even cancer, COPD, heart conditions. And then obviously opportunities in life, such as education and occupation, and even their income. And so this is another way I like to think about it, that we have childhood exposure, which leads to some proximal incomes, our more current outcomes. And those are what we've talked about today: poor academic performance, emotional difficulties, and social impairment. So if left unaddressed, what happens? Well, we move to our more distal and long-term outcomes, right? So chronic health problems, lower rates of employment, and higher rates of incarceration. So in a way, what we're looking at here is what some people call, for example, the school to prison pipeline, right? And how if unaddressed in the school system, we end up increasing their likelihood for not just higher rate of incarceration, but other long-term negative life outcomes. And so what we're hoping to do is eventually reverse that trajectory.
Mm-hmm. So what we would like to do next is revisit Carmen. And I'm going to read the scenario again and then ask a few questions. So Carmen is a student in your math class. It is Drug Prevention Month. Over the past 2 weeks, Carmen has failed to complete several homework assignments. You warned her that if she didn't shape up her grade in the class, her grade in the class would continue to drop. Carmen rolled her eyes. Later that day, when Carmen was answering a question in class, another student made a comment to a nearby student. Carmen heard a whispering. She cursed and threw her book on the floor. She stormed out, knocking over the desk. So earlier, when we presented Carmen to you in the beginning of the training, we asked you to put yourself in the different roles, the teachers or your particular role, because I think we have a diverse audience today. So what I want to ask, I just want to pose a few questions as you rethink this, okay? Would you act differently to Carmen now that, you know, knowing what you know now, or having been exposed to some of the conversations and topics that we had? How would you act differently? And then another question that I have is, do you have more questions about Carmen? Are you as reactionary? Would you be as reactionary before? Or do you have some, in terms of how you reacted to her on a gut feeling prior to our training, are you going to be able to label better what those gut reactions were? So I want you to think those questions as we fill in the blank. So Carmen recently moved in with her grandparents because her mom has been struggling with drug addiction. 2 weeks ago, Carmen's grandfather had a heart attack and had to be taken to the hospital in an ambulance. Carmen hasn't been sleeping well. She stays awake thinking about the ambulance and also worries her mom. Carmen arrived to school exhausted and hungry. So I have 2 questions for you as you take away Carmen's situation. Put yourself in Carmen's shoes. What would it be like for you to come to school that day? And then I want you to put yourself in your own shoes as well. And what potential events and interactions prior to coming to school for you as well could influence your reaction to what Carmen to Carmen's behavior as she comes to school that day as well. So I want to leave you with those 2 questions.
And ultimately, what we hope this first part 1 of this training has helped you to do is really start to make this perspective shift from what we commonly do, which is what's wrong with the student, into what's happening for the student right now, or what has happened. And really, to me, that means just becoming very curious about who they are, what their experiences are, and how you might be able to support them.
So what we wanted to just review is what we've done today. So today we've actually learned how to realize the prevalence and impact of trauma. And we've also been able to address being able to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, especially how they manifest in the classroom. And so in the next week, in the next training, we'll focus on responding by integrating the principles of trauma-informed care into the classroom, as well as resisting re-traumatization as we interact with students in our campuses. And so part 2 would be trauma-informed skills for educators, which is TSIE, and focusing on trauma-responsive strategies for educators. And with that,
I think we're going to pass it back to you, Kelsey, unless there are a few questions that that we're happy to answer.
Yeah, and also, by the way, the contact information for myself and Pamela are also in the handout that is shared with you by MHTTC.
All right, thank you. On behalf of all of our participants, just want to give you a big shout out and thank you for this great information. Someone even commented to us how much they had heard this information, but just having the visuals along with the narrative was really helpful. So thank you again for your time today. Thanks to participants who joined us. We hope you'll join us for the follow-up to this webinar where Pamela and Vivian will dive deeper into skills and strategies. And if you'll go to the next slide. Megan put in the chat the link for the evaluation. we just really hope that you'll take just a few moments to fill out those evaluations. They're so very important to us, and it's just a small thing you can do to help us out. If you have any additional questions, we encourage you to reach out to us. If you're not already signed up for our mailing list, this is how we're going to send out the link to the webinar and future webinars and newsletters and other ways that you can engage with the Northwest MHTTC, and just be aware of other resources that are available to you. So with that, I think we will wrap up this webinar, and again, thank everyone for their time today and all that you all do to support kids and families. And we'll stay on just for a few minutes. Megan has put in some links to the PowerPoint, links to the mailing list. So thank you all for your time today, and we hope to see you on December 4th.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.